There are few films that ever become a cultural phenomenon even before their release. It only really happens when films are based on successful books or are continuations of a film franchise. In other words, brand recognition and a proven track record are essential for these watershed moments. While we have had examples with this with more recent films like Avengers Endgame and Spider-Man No Way Home, Star Wars has been a guaranteed movie event of the year almost every time. Fun fact, here in the United States, businesses would sometimes experience huge losses of productivity on the release dates of new Star Wars films because so many workers would call in sick or take the day off to go see the movie. This sense of anticipation has certainly been diluted now, and I think a lot of that has to do with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. The world seemed to have lost their minds at the prospect of a new Star Wars film set 32 years before the original. No other film had been that hotly anticipated, and there were people camped out by the theaters for a few weeks before this movie's release. And various theaters reported many people paying full price to other movies just to see the trailer for Episode 1 and then walking out. How could any film live up to those expectations? The road to Episode 1 starts all the way back in the 1970s and is laden with as much hearsay and myth as fact. I'll present what I can reasonably determine is accurate, but don't be surprised if you have other sources that say something different. Even though George Lucas wrote an initial screenplay that was far too large for one film, the actual start of what would eventually become the prequel trilogy occurred during the writing of Episode 5. After Lee Brackett wrote her initial draft and unfortunately died, Lucas took over writing duties for a while. In his attempts to hammer out that film, Lucas had to write more of the backstory once he decided that Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader were the same person. He got far enough in the development of this history that it continued to fascinate him for decades. After Lucas finished with Return of the Jedi and decided to cancel the upcoming sequel trilogy, he still very much wanted to make films about Anakin's rise and fall during the Clone Wars. But the technology wasn't quite there yet, and Lucas was exhausted, both creatively and personally. It would take another 10 years before computer-generated imagery got to the photorealism and cost efficiency needed for Lucas's vision to happen. And so in 1994, Lucas began the process of making the prequel trilogy. For a time, Lucas considered doing all 3 episodes at once, much like Lord of the Rings would do later, but the reality of that notion made it unfeasible. Lucas needed a lot of time just to write one script, never mind 3. And when you factor in all the pre-production work, it just wasn't going to happen in a reasonable amount of time. Once that sense of pressure was set aside, Lucas had more fun writing Episode 1 than any of the previous films because he felt like his imagination wasn't limited anymore. Whatever he wanted to make, it could probably be done. Whereas with the original trilogy, he had to make compromises based on what could be accomplished with the current technology. So Lucas went through a number of drafts, trying just about everything he could think of to create a compelling story. One version centered on Obi-Wan as the central character of the trilogy, another having Qui-Gon be the name of the apprentice who takes on the name of Obi-Wan upon his master's death, who was also named Obi-Wan, and so on. Eventually, Lucas realized the heart of the story could be focused on Anakin leaving his mother and becoming a Jedi, but that scenario wasn't enough to fill an entire film by itself. So Lucas decided to flesh out Padme's and the Jedi's struggles as well, seeing as Padme and Obi-Wan would be key figures in Anakin's later downfall. Lucas had intended for someone else to come in and polish the script, much as Lawrence Kasdan had done during the previous 2 films, as well as getting someone else to direct the movie. However, none of the directors who were asked seemed to want to take on the challenge, and the writing process had taken so long that there was no time to stop the wheels of pre-production to allow another writer to start their process. So these twin creative duties fell squarely on Lucas's shoulders. But at the same time, the challenge of directing this film was exciting. George was an experimental filmmaker at heart, and the opportunities that Episode 1 provided in fully realizing a director's vision with CGI, as well as potentially shooting digitally on later films, proved irresistible. Episode 1 had a long production, and was delayed a few times, eventually releasing on May 19, 1999, upon an ecstatic public and to an amazing box office take of over $900 million. Even though the public reaction afterward was very mixed, the film has been re-released a few times in cinemas, with the 2012 3D re-release finally bumping the gross to $1 billion, and a further reissue for its 25th anniversary in 2024 that competed very well with other films in the marketplace. Two Jedi Knights, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, are sent out to Naboo to resolve a trade dispute involving the Trade Federation. Upon their arrival, they are hunted by the Federation and are witness to a planet-wide invasion. They stow away down onto the planet, and with the help of a local creature named Jar Jar Binks, they infiltrate the capital city of Theed. Problem is, the Queen, local government, and all of the citizens have been captured. The Jedi liberate the Queen and her advisors, and the group flee in order to appeal to the Senate on Coruscant for help. During the escape, the ship is damaged, and the group head to a closer world called Tatooine for repairs. Once there, Qui-Gon meets a talented boy named Anakin Skywalker, a slave who not only likes to tinker with machines, but who also seems to have a stronger connection with the Force than any other living Jedi. Now, in addition to finding a way off Tatooine to save the besieged planet and its people, Qui-Gon is also now presented with the captivating mystery of the Skywalker family, and how it could impact the entire galaxy. Unlike virtually every other movie I've reviewed so far, Episode 1 has been covered extensively by many other critics. I doubt I'll have much new to add to the discussion, especially over 25 years after the film made its initial tidal wave takeover of the box office. The only thing I can add is my own feelings about how this film lands with me. Even 10 years ago, this would have been a daunting task because the public's reaction to this franchise is ever evolving. Every film after the original has been subject to intense scrutiny, and over time, the public always seems to ease off on that criticism, especially whenever a new project comes along to take the spotlight. I'll be honest, I'm glad to see that the prequels are emerging out from under the torture shed of public bashing that they were unfairly kept in for too long. People who grew up with the films are now coming out in defense of these movies, and I for one welcome the increased positivity towards any Star Wars film. However, that does not mean that I think the films don't have their fair share of problems, and however nostalgic I am towards this franchise, I still have quite a few criticisms to lob at them. So let's get into it. My first problem with Episode 1 stems with the decisions made with Anakin. This is not a slight on Jake Lloyd or his performance. He was a child actor without much experience being directed by a man notoriously famous for not being, in the words of Terrence Stamp, a director of actors. Rather, I take issue with these choices on a narrative front, and be warned, this is a multi-strand problem, so it's going to take some time to lay it all out. Let's tackle Anakin's entrance into the Jedi first. On the one hand, I get where Lucas may be coming from in deciding to make Anakin the chosen one. The Jedi are highly spiritual people that can sense the future, so there would need to be a strong case made to allow Anakin into the Order, given that he will become one of the greatest evils the galaxy has ever known. Yet Anakin needs to become a Jedi in order for the original trilogy to happen, so Qui-Gon needs to have a reason beyond simple intuition to force the Council to accept Anakin. So, Skywalker is made the child of prophecy, as well as being off the miserable chart in midichlorian count, so we have both a religious and scientific reason to consider Anakin for training in spite of his age and the dark future. However, the thing that changes the Council's mind is not what Qui-Gon presents, but rather that Anakin accidentally blew up the control ship. Really? An accident guided by the Force was more convincing than their own tests and Qui-Gon's evidence? This makes the Council seem more like obstacles subject to the writer's whims than actual characters. They first oppose the entrance, and then they suddenly allow it without much provocation. To add further insult to injury, Yoda, the wisest of them all, voices his concerns about Anakin's dark future after the battle, and yet he bends to the will of the others. Why? If the foreboding sense of doom and gloom was so strong before, one feat, no matter how amazing, should not be enough to get this highest body of governing Jedi to change their minds. At this point, the Council seems to me to be filled with fools who are unwittingly walking to their deaths at the hands of the Sith. Some apologists may argue that that's the point, that the Jedi are meant to be short-sighted, and that the prequels are using this as part of an interesting commentary about how evil may arise from the humblest of sources under watchful eyes, which is a fair way to look at it. Heck, even the Acolyte was built off of this idea. However, I would argue that if the Jedi are really as flawed as these projects make them out to be, then I don't see much reason to care about them beyond certain key recognizable characters. So their eventual fall as an order is not as much a tragedy as Episode 3 makes it out to be. It also further paints the future films in an awkward light because now both Luke and Rey are looking to restore a glorious order that was never that glorious from the start, so it seems to take some of the nobility and optimism from their respective quests. Plus, having a prophecy in here raises a few questions. What is the actual prophecy? What does bringing balance to the Force mean? And why should the Jedi put any stock in a prophecy? Without even a simple explanations of these things in film, this idea comes off as the writer manufacturing stakes in order to increase the importance of these events. Another potentially larger issue arises. By making Anakin the most important character in this galaxy's history, doesn't that diminish the attraction of doing more stories post-Episode 6? If Star Wars essentially begins and ends with a prophesied chosen one destroying the undisputed greatest evil to the galaxy, why should I care about Luke building up the Jedi Order, Han and Leia's children, or the New Republic fighting off the Imperial remnants? To be fair, this was an issue I had before Disney bought the franchise and continued the series. It's like doing more stories with Frodo after Sauron is destroyed. You've had a true finale and it would feel pointless to see anything else later. The story is over. If Star Wars was just meant to be the one story, okay. But by Lucas choosing to elevate Anakin to the status of the Star Wars Messiah just to make this episode work, isn't he cutting off any narrative incentive to tell anything new that doesn't relate to Anakin? Let's move on to Anakin's place in the story of this film specifically. Other reviewers have made valid points that Anakin isn't the real protagonist of this film, and so we're left with a few other options. I'm going with Qui-Gon as the protagonist, since he is the one that makes the most pivotal choices and is in the front seat of the narrative a lot. However, this backfires because it makes Episode 1 almost completely superficial to the rest of the movies. If the series is supposed to be the story of Anakin Skywalker, as Lucas claims, then why are we starting that story and spending a third of a trilogy with someone else as the lead who dies by the end of the movie, and a second larger plot that revolves around a third character? It makes the film feel more like a prologue to the rest of the series rather than a true first act. As far as I can tell, the most important things that happen to Anakin in this film that set the stage for later events is his leaving his mother and becoming a Jedi under Obi-Wan's hand. Okay, fair enough. Those things should be seen as part of Anakin's journey, and the scene with Anakin leaving his mother is the most heartfelt of the movie. However, as presented in this film, that's not enough to carry a 2-hour story, so they are interspersed through a tale about a queen fighting for her people. The two strands are mostly independent of each other, despite happening at the same time. My question would then be, couldn't we then just have these done as flashbacks within another episode? One where Anakin is clearly the protagonist, so we're not using valuable real estate on characters and events largely unrelated to Anakin's tragedy. My guess is no, given how Lucas made his Star Wars films. In each of the 6 episodes, the plot is presented in a straightforward fashion. There are no flashbacks, flash forwards, or non-linearity to the stories. Each scene presented is either happening after the previous one or maybe even concurrently, so it gives this series a sense of history being played out in real time. So unless we were going to do a detached prologue, much like Rogue One would do later, Lucas must have felt some creative pressure within himself to present the two events as they happened within a larger tale. Except, as I already talked about, Padme's struggle to free her people has no real bearing on Anakin's journey. He just happens to come along with the group back to Naboo and isn't a key figure in that part of the story, nor is in a great position to understand or influence the events in a meaningful way. If someone other than Anakin took out the droid control ship, the third act of the movie could play out exactly the same way without making much of a difference. For a story that is supposed to set the stage for the coming events, much as episodes 4 and 7 do with their trilogies, this feels the most detached from the events of its respective trilogy, and thus I'm always tempted to start with episode 2 when I rewatch the series, since Clones essentially reintroduces the characters at a new stage in their lives, and there's not a whole lot from Phantom Menace that you couldn't get from referential lines in that film. There was a roundtable discussion involving Dave Filoni where he explained the importance of the Duel of the Fates as Lucas saw it, and it's an interesting notion that could rectify my problem with episode 1 being mostly superfluous. He explains that the lightsaber battle is for the fate of Anakin's soul. If Qui-Gon had become his master, Anakin would have had a father figure that understood his passions and could have helped guide him into being a better Jedi. Instead, Obi-Wan wins, a man who wasn't interested in Anakin and was siding with the Council initially about his admission into the Order. Obi-Wan is not a father figure, but a brother, so part of Anakin's downfall is because he doesn't have the right kind of master to guide him. However, I have some issues with this interpretation. One, it throws Obi-Wan under the bus pretty hard, implying that he didn't have a prayer properly guiding Anakin and is partly, but inescapably, responsible for his pupil's path, which for me diminishes the personal tragedy of Anakin, a good man who the later films describe as being seduced down the dark path and is ultimately the one who killed Anakin Skywalker. 2, Anakin claims in Episode 2 that he sees Obi-Wan as a father figure, so that makes me scratch my head. 3, saying Obi-Wan was a brother and not a father to Anakin as a reason for Anakin not being properly guided is an oversimplification that kind of irks me personally, given that I had older siblings who taught and helped shape me as much as my actual dad did, and I don't think I was lessened as a person by having my older brother teach me things my dad didn't. Plus, this series has a history of protagonists who learn from under people who were decisively not long-lasting father figures, and most of them turned out okay. And 4, it further fuels my earlier point about this trilogy's depiction of the Jedi being an order past its prime, diminishing the later films. If Obi-Wan, one of the purest embodiments of what the Jedi are, is partly the blame for Anakin's fall, then there really is something to Luke's reluctance to return to the galaxy in The Last Jedi and his calling for the end of the Jedi, that the Jedi create more problems than they solve. And isn't that a downer for a series that is supposed to be an old-fashioned good versus evil tale? I'm also a bit bothered by Lucas's choice to highlight the politics of the situation. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people who complain about endless scenes in the Senate. I mean, they're not that long, you guys. And it makes a lot of sense to do a politically charged story that sets up the simple rebellion versus evil empire conflict of the original films. But there are a few problems with this angle. First, we don't get a lot of clarification on some of the most important details of the politics here. How does signing a piece of paper make an invading force legal, and why is Sidious so hell-bent on that happening? How does the Trade Federation succeeding help him conquer the galaxy when he already seems to have a good plan in place to become Chancellor? Throw shade at the current guy and trust the electoral process. My guess is that Palpatine is such a master planner that he would have several schemes in motion. Okay, but then what if more than one plan succeeds? He succeeds at his plan of becoming Chancellor, but what if the Trade Federation won the battle and ended up killing every one of the heroes? No more Padme, no more Obi-Wan, and no more Anakin. Given how Palpatine seems to treat Anakin as his key to the grand design later, this feels like an oversight on Lucas's part. As skilled as a warrior as Maul is, he wouldn't be in as nearly as good a position as Anakin will be to help destroy the Jedi Order later. I'm just not seeing the logic in these plans if Palpatine's goals are to get the galaxy to where it is by the original trilogy. Jedi gone, Empire takes over, all that jazz. I've seen some people argue that Palpatine knew the outcome of all these events, so multiple seemingly conflicting plans isn't an issue. However, if we go that far with Palpatine being that omniscient of all events, then I don't see much point in focusing on such a convoluted scheme to transform the Republic into an empire and watching a hero fall over a 7-hour trilogy if it was all basically predetermined. I'd be better off watching just the 6-minute recap Lucasfilm made to go in front of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. My second big issue with the politics is that, despite them being a key feature of this trilogy, they are overly simplified, and the films don't have a good grasp of how to dramatize the politics to make them a compelling component in their own right. They largely serve as a backdrop to Anakin's story rather than being a fleshed-out element. We get just enough to understand what the broad strokes are, but it's not as if the series turns into House of Cards or The Post, where the politics are actually part of the story's DNA and are thoroughly explored. One of the big reasons to make the prequels is to see the rise of the Empire so that the stakes of the original trilogy become more clear. We should be able to better sympathize with the plight of the rebellion because we saw what was lost, how quickly the Republic became an evil and oppressive empire, and thus we get a sense for how hard it is for a guerrilla group of ragtags to bring back peace and prosperity to a complacent galaxy ruled under a government that rotted out a long time ago. And that involves politics as much as action. Now let's take a step back. I do understand that Lucas has said for a long time that these films are made for children, so a heavy political thriller wouldn't appeal to the more family-oriented crowd that got into the originals, and I think that's a fair point. But that's just the issue. All of these things I've described seem to be pointing to one larger problem. My biggest hang-up with Episode 1, and the prequels for that matter, is that Lucas is trying to have his cake and eat it too. The things at the heart of this trilogy require more careful handling than those of the original films. The prequels are filled with some heavy and complex ideas that they want to depict, as well as also showing a story that is much more personal and intimate than the original films. And Lucas just isn't the right guy to tackle that kind of challenge. George isn't a writer who knows how to weave a consistent, complex tapestry, nor is he a director who knows how to work with actors well enough so as to get the most out of them. So some of his ambitions for the prequels were not suited to his particular talents. Thus, the trilogy as a whole displays both the positives and negatives of being a sole creator's vision. Episode 1 and the other films are highly imaginative and touch upon some fascinating ideas. They are technical tour de forces that did a lot of good for filmmaking as a whole. But the stories and characters are restrained because of the limitations of Lucas as a creator, and it inadvertently creates problems for the franchise as a whole. In a way, I see the prequels as victims of themselves. Their sights were set so high that there was no real way to hit them with Lucas solely at the helm of this, a man who would be the first to admit he was far more at home with the technical process of filmmaking than crafting a story on the page. The later seasons of the Clone Wars TV show from 2008, which was overseen by Lucas, handled a lot of these aspects better, like Season 3's political arc examining both the Republic and Confederacy, or Season 5's framing of Ahsoka highlighting the failures of the Jedi. However, he did have Dave Filoni and various writers to help him flesh out these concepts, so the success of those later stories cannot be attributed to him alone. So it might seem like I hate this film, and I don't. It is one of my least favorites in the series, though there's a lot to love about this movie beyond my issues. This is a phenomenal cast, with Liam Neeson and Ewan McGregor verging on perfect casting, two wonderfully colorful characters like Boss Nass, Sebulba, and Watto. True, a lot of the main cast give lower energy performances, but I'm more willing to place this blame on Lucas, as none of these guys are real slouchers in other films. A lot of the action is downright captivating, from the pod race to the Duel of the Fates. Granted, the pod race runs a little long now, especially with the added bits from that first DVD release, and the Duel of the Fates took the lightsaber fights into a direction I personally don't vibe with, but it is hard to imagine that even the most disparaging of critics weren't impressed by at least a few of these bits. Indeed, I think the best things to come out of this film were the video games, from the excellent Episode 1 Racer to the more in-depth lightsaber combat of both the Jedi Knight and later Respawn series. Saying that John Williams provides a wonderful score is such a common sentiment that it verges on being wasted breath in film criticism, but it's true. Perhaps one of the biggest travesties in film history is that none of the prequel scores were nominated for Oscars, despite them arguably containing Williams' finest work on the series. The Episode 1 score in particular gets called out because of Duel of the Fates, and fair enough, but there are so many other fantastic bits here, from the droid invasion to Anakin's theme being a sentimental piece that echoes the Imperial March at points, and also Jar Jar's whimsical and playful motif. The whole affair is both subtle and majestic. I don't know if I could ever truly rank the Star Wars scores against each other, but my knee-jerk reaction would be to probably place this as both my favorite of the prequel scores and one of my top 3 in the series. A common criticism of the prequels was the heavy reliance on CGI, and while that is true, particularly with the next 2 films, I think Episode 1 has a great look to it. There's a good balance between the CGI and the practical model work, locations, and sets. In fact, there were more models built for this trilogy than either the original or the sequel trilogies. The CGI does look a bit dated at places, but that's natural after 25 years of advancements in the industry, and to be honest, I'm not thinking about it when Anakin is racing down canyons at 600 miles an hour after Sebulba. I also have to wonder if part of my fondness for the look of this film is the choice to shoot it on 35mm. I really don't have a dog in the fight between shooting on film versus digital, except that both options have their merits. But I find that film tends to lend a certain grit and down-to-earth authenticity to the footage. This is one of my favorites in the series on a visual level, and I absolutely think it was the right move to go back to shooting on film for Episode 7. The design work of this film is inspired. It doesn't look much like the original trilogy, but it does feel appropriate within this universe. The N1 fighter is one of my favorite ships in the series, and I was so happy to see it reused from the Mandalorian's second ship. Naboo has a great atmosphere, balancing the more biological and organic-driven Gungan environments with the refined and artificial sensibilities of the people of Theed. Mos Espa feels even more dangerous than Mos Eisley, and we get a better sense for what life was like on the planet than we did in the original films. Coruscant is my favorite planet of the series, and it looks perfect. I mean, you can't do better than perfect, right? Darth Maul is a nothing character in this film, but his look and lightsaber style stayed with people, and I'm convinced that popularity is the reason the character was brought back in the Clone Wars and made one of the best villains in the franchise. So yeah, there's a lot going for the Phantom Menace, and I can understand how some people still love it despite what I see as glaring issues on a fundamental level. It's filled with imagination and a real drive to be a different experience from the original trilogy. However, I think it's an incredibly boring film to watch for large chunks. It's the weakest start to a trilogy this series has on a storytelling level, and it creates problems for the saga as a whole in an effort to justify starting the story of Anakin here. Lucas half succeeds in his goals. It's hard to deny this as a landmark film on a technical level and in marketing movies, but it's also hard to argue that this is the best film in handling its story and characters. For many years, I heard this described as one of the worst and most disappointing films of all time. And while there are still some people who stand by that claim, there is a growing number who champion this film as being better than the reaction it garnered. I might not be in that same camp, despite being the perfect age when this came out, but I would agree that I've definitely seen worse and more disappointing films than this, even amongst Star Wars films. I mean, between the original theatrical release and subsequent reissues, I've seen this film in theaters 9 times, so that's gotta count for something. The reaction to Episode 1 weighed on Lucas and crew. I don't think George was trying to coast on his past reputation. I think he was genuinely trying to make a good movie. But the backlash did get to him, and I think clearly affected how he went about the rest of the trilogy. The movie did fill the coffers of Lucasfilm and basically guaranteed there was enough interest for the next 2, but Lucas was on thin ice with the fans. Unfortunately, the realities of the filmmaking process meant that Lucas couldn't quite take the sabbatical he needed to ponder the loud criticism, as pre-production on Episode 2 began the week after Episode 1's release, and Lucas had to work fast in order to get the film out on time. With the second part of the trilogy being both a love story and the start of a galaxy-wide conflict, it was gearing up to be the turning point of the entire saga in a way that none of the previous films were. So there was hope that the Phantom Menace's reaction would be an anomaly within the series, and Attack of the Clones would be the monumental chapter that would re-cement Star Wars as the pinnacle of modern cinema.